Polaris's Fatalism is a bittersweet banger with a lot to say. Introduction. I think it's fair that I skip all the useless preamble that I would typically be inclined to include in the introduction of this post. This album review is dedicated solely to Ryan. Rest in peace to a legend. I didn't know you, and I hardly knew of you before hearing the news, but anybody with ears, especially in the metalcore scene, knows the impact your work over the years has had on the shift and changes within the genre these last few years, many of them for the better. Polaris's debut album is one that I haven't listened to yet, much to my own dismay and embarrassment, but I have never heard anything but praise for it amongst my friends. Their sophomore effort reached critical acclaim amongst every music group I followed at the time, making a large amount of Album of the Year lists from the moment it released and remains heavily beloved to this day. I don't think anybody had a doubt Polaris would go 3 for 3 with Fatalism, and to me they absolutely did, without a shadow of a doubt, despite my unfamiliarity with the first record, particularly where the singles are concerned, and Ryan has had a part in it all. It's really sad to see such a record release without such a big piece of it here with us, but I am grateful we all got to hear it in spite of such a great loss. For what it's worth, Fatalism is an immensely worthy record to have be your final work, and I want to talk about why. Part 1. The Death of Me. The Death of Me took the metalcore world by storm back in early 2020 and garnered quite the reputation amongst the music circles that I tend to reside. The stylistic tendencies of the record swung from breakneck to a bit more balanced and back again, in much the same way the tone and general musicality swung from heavy to melodic in some fantastic ways. With intensely introspective lyrics, the album smashed into the scene with a force to be reckoned with, and it worked for just about everybody. I remember listening to that album for the first time and exactly where I was sitting in my high school cafeteria working on some sort of essay or something. I remember going through waves of that classic heavy stink face, and then the expected feels or reels to offset it all. Overall, I enjoyed myself, but the record didn't quite leave a distinct mark on me like it seemed to for everybody else. But since I hate being a wet blanket, I never really said anything about that and let everybody have their love for the album. That said, I never, ever would say I disliked The Death of Me. In fact, there are a few tracks I still quite enjoy, such as Above My Head and Martyr, Waves. And I actually have used drum charts of much of this album for my drumming exercises now and again as well too, for something a bit more various and interesting and to test myself, as the drumming on the album is actually surprisingly complex. I appreciated, and still do, The Death of Me for what it was and is, and nowadays want to give a dedicated re-listen to see if I can finally say I truly love it. Regardless, Polaris made an impression at the top of the decade, and if nothing else, it absolutely paved a way for their next release, an album to take the introspection of The Death of Me and turn it outward a bit. Part 2. The Singles. Inhumane dropped on May 25th, 2023, and it came out swinging. It was a solid single with a solid music video, just enough to get hype building for the upcoming record. But what the single really did right out the gate was make it very clear that this album was going to make a statement, and boy does it bring the heavy to accentuate it. There's a lot of pent-up anger charged in this track, and you can feel it in the relentless energy of it. Nightmare, 2 months later, on July 27th, was a powerhouse release and yet melancholic following the all-too-recent news of Ryan's passing, right in between the releases of the two singles. So immediately, Nightmare is bittersweet in its instrumentality, a beautifully composed track that also knows when to get heavy as well. Nightmare continues several of the themes discussed in Inhumane 2, further confirming the general tone that the record is going for, and does so brilliantly. Plus, it's just a really damn good song. Has one of my favorite breakdowns ever when you include the call-out before it, and it does so well to sell what it's trying to say. The whole pre-apocalyptic wasteland line just hits different, man. And then, after that track truly sold the band for me, Overflow released as a single in late August on the 24th. This one didn't disappoint either, but instead of going for the nearly incessant heavy like the previous singles, this one switches it up and goes for a little bit more of the feels or reels, though it does decide to throw in a really fun and surprisingly fitting breakdown into this one too. Following Ryan's passing, I felt like this one lyrically made for a fitting tribute to him, though retroactively, as the single choice had been made before the tragedy. The music video had already been filmed before his passing. It's a very charming track, and I love it. Over the weeks prior to the album's release in early September, I replayed these songs over and over and over again. I'm not much of a singles guy, musically speaking. I'll listen to maybe one or two singles for any particular album that I'm excited for, and I'll listen to those singles maybe a couple of times, but I usually try not to become super familiar with them, and I basically never listen to more than 3 singles from any release. For some reason, being too familiar with the singles of an album ruins the flow of the record itself for when the time comes for it. To be fair, that did happen to me with Fatalism, and I did have to give it a few spins before I found the same appreciation for the deep cuts as I did for Inhumane Nightmare and Overflow. But a little bit of time was all it took to fall in love with this release as a full package. Part 3. Fatalism. As I just mentioned, there was admittedly a tad bit of that underwhelming feeling with my first initial listen to Fatalism, but that quickly disappeared upon my second and especially third and fourth listens of the record. The singles, which I've put in plenty of time discussing already, are balanced perfectly between other heavy hitters, albeit ones that don't quite have the repeatable appeal that said singles do. But beyond those tracks I've spoken so much of, there are several others that have quickly come into the midst of favorites for this year like those singles did, including With Regards and Dissipate, which could both unironically be great singles in their own regard. Harbinger sets the tone to head straight into an intense, immediate climax in Nightmare to put forth the thematic underpinnings of the record. Parasites, albeit the weakest song of the record, breaks up the pace before going into Overflow to shift the tone of the record, continued immensely well in With Regards, a track that I feel a particular emotional attachment to immediately. If the song came out in my high school years, it would have absolutely been an all-time favorite, and even so rests solidly in my top 3 on Fatalism. This song, I think, could fairly smoothly be made into a genuine tribute dedicated to Ryan, but that might just be me. Following With Regards comes Inhumane, perfectly placed to come right back into the heavy material of the record, which then moves into The Crossfire, which is another heavier track, but with a particular focus on guitar work and riffage that really stood out to me, accentuated by a blistering bridge that leads again directly into the guitar lead that backs the whole riff. Come to think, though, the same could be said for Dissipate, though Dissipate has the added benefit of an insanely catchy and soaring chorus and a final breakdown, there's more than one of them, that rivals only Nightmares on this record despite being a bit more tried and true. The guitar lead on this one is just so good, too, throughout the whole thing. Finally, we come to the final act of Fatalism, which really packs a punch. Aftertouch is a melancholic track that starts off a bit softer and throughout remains slower than the rest of the entire album, and deliberately so in order to punctuate what has come before. The first half of the track keeps the softer feel before becoming a climax fitting of an album closer, to the point that the closing line frankly is closer material in the way it resolves. Obviously, this is kind of a trick ending and allows for Fault Line and All in Vain to feel like a cathartic epilogue without the legitimate catharsis. That makes no sense, but I'm gonna go with it. Fault Line and All in Vain are definitely 2 independent tracks, but every time I try to recall the 2, I come up with both of them together as a single closing package, and it is a solid one. I don't really have anything more specific to say about them, just that they fit the tone of the record and will only grow more powerful with more time as well. Generally, Fatalism is a fantastic record that has truly woken me up to Polaris in a way I never was before, and I'm quite happy about that. I'm just sad that Ryan couldn't be here to see the reaction to the full album. But a bit more on topic of the record's themes itself, which I've briefly mentioned once or twice but haven't explored, I love what this album is doing. The band themselves have described the record as a culmination of the last 3 years' emotions, the triumphs and tribulations and everything in between. It is an album about fear and, on the band's Spotify About page itself, not strictly a pandemic album, but the combined events of the years clearly had a huge impact on the creation of the album, which carries over to the listening experience of this record, especially when done with lyrics on standby. Conclusion. So, is Fatalism Album of the Year? Well, it's definitely on the list, if nothing else, and that's in the midst of an already insane year for music. When it comes time for the album of the year list, I'll have to decide whether I think this or Take Me Back to Eden, another album I have a review of, takes the cake. It's a bit too early to tell for me right now, and there's still Beartooth to come as well. With all that being said, I truly connected with these singles in a way I have scarcely ever connected to singles, save only for maybe Beartooth's singles since Riptide dropped last year. If nothing else, Nightmare is surely to be on a theoretical Song of the Year list at the end of the year. But overall, I really like Fatalism already, and it's clicked for me a lot better than The Death of Me did. I think it's time to truly give that record another spin and to finally give The Mortal Coil a shot since I've never listened to it before. Polaris has created a masterpiece with this, and it will only grow better with time, especially given its message and the way the world continues to go. Finally, I also hope to see Fatalism soon get the instrumental edition that both of Polaris's previous records have, as a truly beautiful send-off to Ryan and the work he put in to evolve this genre and music as a whole. And while that there makes for a fine close to this post, I do want to make a final point I believe I've left incomplete up to this point in the review. So I hope if you made it this far that you'll bear with me for one more paragraph. I won't do much analyzing of the album itself lyrically or thematically, despite referencing it a number of times up to this point. The reason for this is because I think the combined experience of the time since The Death of Me released in early 2020 is deeply personal to each individual who may listen to this album, and I want everybody to experience it for themselves, to interpret the words of the songs however they are naturally wont to do. In the end, a lot of my appreciation for the thematic work of Fatalism comes down to how it can clearly be interpreted so many different ways and be pasted onto a number of different contexts that completely change the meanings of different tracks. There is a thematic thread that runs through it, but it's never forced on every track to only be that. There are some songs here, such as With Regards, that I have already come up with 2 or 3 different personal interpretations that I see myself flipping between depending on my mood. I think that Fatalism will ultimately hit with many listeners on a different level than just musically, because it is a canvas of the last 3 years, one that simultaneously holds all of the paintings of those who created it, all those who have listened to it up to this point, and all those who ever will listen to it. And yet, through all of that, Fatalism also manages to leave the canvas blank to you, too, to paint it all over again, and for that, I think it will forever hold a special place, not just in the releases of 2023, but in all the releases of the 2020s as a whole.